The Shipping Podcast with the UK Chamber of Shipping and Lloyd's List.
Welcome to The Shipping Podcast from the UK Chamber of Shipping and Lloyd's List. My name is Jonathan Roberts. In this first edition, we ask, has the UK's coalition government been good for the shipping industry? What does the shipping industry need from the next UK government? And with continued talk of an EU referendum, is the EU a help or a hindrance for the UK shipping industry? And joining me in the studio, David Balston, Director of Policy at the UK Chamber of Shipping, and David Osler, Finance Editor at Lloyd's List. So, 5 years of coalition government in the UK has come to an end. With a general election imminent, has the Conservative-led government been good for the UK shipping industry? David Balston.
Well, that's a very interesting question. And, I would say that actually, whatever colour, whatever shape of government, when you're talking about shipping tends to be fairly apolitical. So actually the colour and the shape of the government is less important. What is more important, perhaps, is the incumbent, who is the shipping minister. But even then, you'd have to say, well, in the last 5 years, we've had three. They tend to come in, they tend to go very quickly. And so by the time a shipping minister gets to the point where he actually fully understands the scope of his responsibilities, fully understands all the issues, fully understands actually where the weaknesses or the strengths lie in his own team, he's probably moving on. And so it's possibly, one could say, arguably, what is more important is actually the officials behind the scene and how they are. There are some very good officials at the moment within the department, but on occasions they have been, I think, less than helpful for some ministers, and the more experienced ministers see through that and control them, and the less experienced don't.
So the politicians, are you saying the politicians don't matter so much as the people who are working behind the scenes, both in the UK government and elsewhere, I guess?
No, I'm not saying they don't matter, but I'm merely saying that if they are in post for merely a year to 18 months, which most of them have been, it's very difficult for them to shape and to stamp their own authority on the department. So we first of all had a very, arguably a very engaging and a very engaged shipping minister in Mike Penning. I mean, he was good in many respects. He did some very early good things on ship-to-ship transfers, for instance. He was an individual who kind of fired from the hip. We then had a rather more studied individual in Stephen Hammond, again, very likeable, very earnest, very keen to do the best he could for shipping. But I would say that he was an individual who was led astray by his officials on one particular issue, at least, and that was on the sulphur regulations, so that when he performed and when he spoke at the adjournment debate shortly before the end of his tenure, I think he was led astray by his officials. He said things which were patently untrue, wrong. And then we've now more recently obviously had John Hayes, who I think has been exceptional. He's been exceptionally good. But then he is a far more experienced, he's a more senior individual, and he went in straight from the word go, saying, right, okay, this is how we're going to do things, and this is how I'm going to fight the battle, particularly in Europe.
And David Osler, you've been commentating on shipping issues for a long time. Have you seen ebbs and flows and qualities of minister, and how much does it matter?
Well, I think that's putting it mildly. We once sat down in the Lloyd's List office and tried to come up with a list of every shipping minister we could remember for the last 20 years. It was a long list, and there were some that were, frankly, so forgettable that even collectively we were scratching our heads trying to remember who the hell came after that guy. But I think the last 5 years we've seen three different ministers, three contrasting personalities, and they've had mixed political fortunes. Mike Penning was a very personable guy, always remembered your name, and did a lot of things that the industry wanted him to do, especially parking the recommendation on equal wages for foreign crew, the ship-to-ship transfer regulations, the Irish lighthouse questions. On the downside, this was a stage in this government's life cycle where it was engaged in a lot of cuts, and quite a few things went. There were some cuts to smart funding for training, cuts to the crew cost relief scheme, the confidential hazardous incidents reporting scheme, Coast Guard rescue sources, maritime incident response group, the firefighting at sea capability. So quite a long list. I actually think Stephen Hammond, contrasting personality, I think, a more traditional Tory in many ways, parliamentary under-secretary rather than a minister, but I never got the same sense that he was as much at ease in the brief as his predecessor was, even though he took on board a lot of useful policies. And finally we have John Hayes, who has promised to explore what he can do for the shipping industry. I'm sure we're going to be talking about the National Maritime Growth Strategy later on, and be interested to find out how that's going. But it's late in the political cycle. We won't know the outcome of that until the summer, when we may or may not have a new government.
David Balston, give us one really good achievement of the last 5 years.
Well, I think from a very parochial point of view, we in the UK Chamber built up a very, very strong relationship with this coalition government, and we developed with them a strategic partnership plan. And out of the strategic partnership plan has come the Maritime Growth Study, which I think is a once-in-a-lifetime, once-in-a-generational opportunity to really shape how shipping should be in this country.
And so what is this? So this is a full-scale review of how we do shipping, what we could do better, how we can fight off the competition from abroad, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's where it came from. It came from the view that actually other flag states, other countries were attracting more shipping than the UK, attracting almost faster than the UK could lose its own shipping, which is very worrying indeed. So, for instance, over the last 2.5 years, we've seen over 2 million gross tonnes. The UK flag declined by over 2 million gross tonnes, which is a huge percentage. So we're now down to about 13 million, where we had been about 18 million gross tonnes, which is, of course, extremely worrying. And part of that reasoning as well is because there is a lack of confidence in the flag, not because of the flag is not adhering to very high standards, which it is, but because of the service they actually get from the flag, making life difficult for shipping companies.
And this is from the MCA, I guess, right?
Yes.
Give me one thing that the MCA could do to really boost its customer service.
Well, I would say they need to adopt a far more commercial approach to the way they do their business. At the moment, they have a very civil service approach, and they need to recognise that actually shipping is a 365-day, 24-hour-a-day business. And so that when a ship completes a repair, and if it needs to have an inspection for its sails, and even if that's the middle of the night, then the inspector needs to get out there so the ship can sail on the next tide, because if it doesn't, it's losing money.
But of course, you'll be aware that not everyone agrees with that assessment of the situation. Some people think that the MCA have gone too far down that road already. I mean, the unions in particular have accused it of making the red ensign into a glorified flag of convenience. So I'm not close enough to being a ship owner to actually know what the situation is on the ground, but I'm aware there's another side to the argument.
Oh no, but I think to call it a glorified flag convenience is, well, I would completely disagree with that, because were it a glorified flag convenience, we wouldn't have lost 2 million gross tonnes over the last 2.5 years. Ship owners feel that the restrictive practices which are being operated by the UK, and particularly by the MCA, and the lack of commercial awareness, the individual responses to particular regulations, and so the lack of consistency, all of which leads to uncertainty and a difficult environment in which to operate. And sadly, many of the other flags, like Malta, and other European flags like Malta and Cyprus, are growing at our expense, let alone the Far Eastern flags.
But David Osler, I understand the point you're making. We've got to remain competitive, don't we? It's fiercely competitive out there. We've got the rise of countries in the Far East, in the Middle East, and before long in Africa as well.
Yeah, of course, but it's the question, as ever, is how do you compete? And there shouldn't be competition on standards. I feel. People have pointed out, for instance, that the number of vessel inspections that the MCA is undertaking these days is far lower than it was. It's in compliance with the revised Paris Memorandum standards, but still, the numbers are down. There are people who do argue that standards are slipping because there are fewer resources, there aren't enough inspectors to go round. And these are, we've got to be lean and mean, but there are dangers in that. You got to be careful about cutting corners, I guess.
I just don't want there to be any doubt into the fact that I'm not suggesting for a moment we should compromise on standards of the flag. I completely, wholeheartedly support high standards. The industry does as well. And yes, he's absolutely right to say that, yes, there are fewer inspectors, fewer surveyors, and fewer resources. And that is a source of concern. So we are saying, well, actually, one reason is because you've got a guy who's coming from sea to go and be an inspector or a surveyor, and he's actually going to be taking a huge pay drop. And we should be paying these people more competitively if we want the best people to be doing the job. So, yeah, I'm not advocating for 1 second a drop on standards.
I guess what we all agree on is that we need real long-term strategic thinking, which I guess what this maritime growth study the UK government has started is all about. And I just want to explore that a little bit further. Is the existence of the growth study a sign that the industry is really getting its lobbying act together and using its collective voice, if you like?
Yes, we've also arguably been lucky, if lucky is the right word, in three very good shipping ministers, or three very receptive shipping ministers, who are prepared to work with industry to, I think, to try and get the UK in a better place for shipping and to try and turn around the decline.
Of course, there haven't been any public announcements on the study group's deliberations yet. I mean, I don't know what you can tell us, but yeah, if you can you give us some idea of what's being talked about and how the study is shaping up?
I mean, I probably have no more information than most people on exactly what is or is not going to be agreed. I know some of the things they're talking about, some of the things we actually recommended, because, of course, when the Maritime Growth Study was announced, we immediately, we had already written and we immediately put in a paper outlining a number of strands, one of which was a real root and branch reform of the MCA, which we think is absolutely critical. But also we think that what is going to be vitally important in the future is that the government and ministers need to have far greater accountability for shipping, because at the moment, if something was to happen, which you could argue, well, okay, yes, it has a huge impact on shipping, but is kind of peripheral to shipping, in a sense. A very recent example would be the dramatic lowering of oil prices, which clearly has had a massive impact on shipping up in the North Sea. But the lead UK departments are not necessarily anything to do with shipping at all. It'll be the Treasury and others, and BIS and others. Well, we need to have a strategic voice cutting across all government departments on anything which impacts on shipping, and that should be ministerially led.
Right, and if there is a change of administration, I mean, do you expect buy-in from other possible governments?
I would hope so. I mean, I remember, when I first came to the Chamber, it was with this coalition government, but then it just come into power. I met and worked closely, though, with the previous shipping minister, Jim Fitzpatrick. He was extremely approachable, and that's why I said right at the beginning of this that I actually believe shipping to be fairly apolitical. So I would really, really hope, whatever shape or colour of party, that we will still be able to take this forward.
Well, I suppose when you're in an industry that moves 95% of the UK's international trade, we all talk about that a lot in the industry. It doesn't always get through to government. But government, it kind of has no choice but to be supportive of shipping, does it? Just looking into the future, give us one thing that the next government could do to ensure that the UK can compete and deliver on the kind of things that you're talking about.
Well, I think the main priority, rather than any specific policy, is, as you say, to take shipping seriously. It is a very important industry. It is an industry that contributes £6 billion a year to GDP and provides for over 200,000 jobs. All we can really ask, I think, is that the next government, of whatever shade it is, appoints a good quality minister, preferably at Minister of State level rather than Under Secretary level, and give him or her long enough to get into their stride. Encourage Britain's remaining strength in shipping, particularly in the shipping services business.
We've got a situation now where global sea trade is rising. That provides job opportunities and certain training requirements. The world needs more seafarers. Does this provide an opportunity for the UK, David Balston? We know we've got world-class training facilities and colleges here in the UK. Can we create a seafaring generation?
Well, yes, I would really like to see that. And I think actually the current shipping minister really gets it. He has a background in apprenticeships and training. And so I think he realises it. And so yes, I would very much like to see, whatever colour or shape the new government administration is, that it does continue with this work. And I would love to see a UK shipping industry in which it is a more competitive place in which to employ UK seafarers, both officers and ratings.
What do you think it will take, Dave?
I'm less optimistic than David. I spend a lot of time looking at the German shipping industry in particular. I can see now that they're in the situation that British shipping was in maybe 20 or 30 years ago, where they are starting to think about flagging out on a large scale. Some companies such as NSB are doing that. I'm just not sure how much longer or European seafarers are going to be competitive in world markets, or if they still are. I'm rather a pessimist on that one.
But people respect, the ship owners that I've spoken to in my time in the industry, they respect high quality training and skills. We've got that in the UK. We've got some truly world-class colleges. And that's why wannabe seafarers, for want of a better term, travel from all over the world to come here and get their training. Being highly skilled keeps you competitive, doesn't it? It's not just about wages and so on.
That's true, but the latest generation of young Asians are even sharper, even cleverer than the Asians of my generation, the young Asians that I knew at college a generation ago. They are seriously, scarily smart and seriously willing to work for lower wages. I don't think there's any question that they're somehow inferior to a European seafarer's intake, and crucially, they'll work for lower wages. So, I'm quite pessimistic on it.
Well, that's sad news, David Balston. Are you a bit more positive about it?
To be honest, and to perhaps rephrase what I said earlier on, this is what I'm actually hoping for. I'm not necessarily saying it will happen, and I kind of shared David's pessimism, actually, because it is phenomenally difficult, because even if the government was to, say, increase smart funding, and we had more UK officers and hopefully ratings going through a funded training scheme, which I have to say I completely agree with you, in the UK is second to none in the world, we're still left to the point when the training is all finished, where do they get their first job? And all too often, unfortunately, it's not actually with UK shipping companies, but it should be.
It might be yet another case of Britain maintaining its strength in maritime training,
but not training
British seafarers. I mean, just as we maintain our matchless strength in maritime law firms, maritime accountancy, shipbroking, but we're not providing these services primarily to a British market. It could go that way.
I want to explore that a little bit with especially the British companies. There was a time many years ago when there were countless British ship owners, purely British ship owners. We still have some, but that number is significantly fewer than it was. If you look elsewhere in the world, places like Hong Kong, you'll get brokers and so on who are giving it a go, who are deciding to buy their first ship because they know the industry backwards. We're not getting that so much in the UK. Is the field of British maritime entrepreneurship dying, much like you're saying the training of British seafarers is?
But I think a lot of entrepreneurship in the UK is a difficult environment in which to be an entrepreneur, sadly, now, because all too often the UK, the current coalition government as well, does gold plate other standards. So, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, the first thing obviously you need is finance. If you look at the financial and some of the financial levers and mechanisms, so the Basel Convention is being implemented for probably very understandable reasons because of all that's happened in the banking world. And the UK wants to be highly responsible and wants to make sure everything's properly stress tested. But the Basel regulations is being brought in a way which is less competitive than in other European countries, which is clearly going to make anyone trying to set up business in this country, as in shipping in particular, more difficult.
Well, that brings us on to our final question of this edition of the Shipping Podcast. The UK does have a funny relationship with the European Union. It never seems to want to play a full part in it, with many people not wanting to be part of it at all. The shipping industry has a global regulator already in the IMO, but with the European Union acting as a regulator as well, is the EU a help or a hindrance for the shipping industry?
Well, I think the contrasting examples of Greece and Norway show that you can be a shipping success story inside the European Union and you can be a shipping success story outside the European Union. I don't think it's a crucial question. What we do need to, as you point out, what we need to avoid is a drift towards regional, unilateral imposition of rules. I mean, the shipping industry and the Chamber's insistence that this has to be done multilaterally through the IMO, I mean, is really something, and the point I really hope that the Chamber continues to stress.
So is it really a case of just asking the European Commission to back off when it comes to IMO regulations?
Well, it is in some circumstances, certainly. I mean, but one shouldn't lose touch and shouldn't lose the vision of what actually is important in a European context for shipping, because, of course, being a member of the EU has brought a great deal of wealth to the UK shipping industry. And in many areas, it has been extremely helpful. There are some areas where actually we would want more EU action.
Give an example of that, David.
What, of more EU action?
Yeah.
Well, I think there is still some uncertainty over the EU state aid rules, for example, what that's going to mean in future for tonnage tax regimes. We would like that all clarified and more certainty on that. But I think in terms of unhelpful regulation, I don't think the UK government should be as worried, and there's very understandable political reasons why they are standing up when they've got a lot bigger fish to fry, in their view, do they really want to go all out pushing against something in the shipping world, which might lose them political clout for a bigger issue elsewhere? But notwithstanding that, I still believe that the shipping minister, the future shipping minister, whoever it is, needs to be prepared to stand up to the EU at times when it is being very unhelpful, and it's gold-plating IMO standards, which it has done most certainly with the sulphur regulations, it is doing with the recycling regulations. I mean, the list is almost endless. It is doing so with carbon regulations and reporting. And the thing is, if you really believe, which I do passionately, in the reduction of carbon emissions, then what actually the European Union is doing is so counterproductive, because they will just put up barriers in the IMO, because a lot of those the developing countries will say, whoa, no, we're not going to be driven by the EU. And whereas they were making progress, albeit I will be the first to admit very slow progress, but towards some form of carbon regulation, I think they're going to back very firmly away. So the EU can be its own worst enemy.
Has the Chamber taken a position on the Ports Directive?
Well, yes. Again, that is something we would list as being an unhelpful regulation, because the UK ports actually manage themselves extremely well, very competitively, and I think actually if you bring this in, it would be a retrograde step for the management of the ports.
So you're on the same hymn sheet as the UK Major Ports Group and the British Ports Association on this one?
By and large, yes. I mean, we could go down in some of the nuance and some of the detail, but by and large we would support them, yes.
All interesting stuff. Well, we're coming to an end of this first shipping podcast. You can follow the UK Chamber on Twitter at UK Shipping and Lloyd's List at Lloyd's List. David Osler, you're on Twitter too, aren't you?
Yes, I'm there as finance_LL.
Finance_LL, because you're finance editor, of course, aren't you?
Yes, for all the latest developments on ship finance news and breaking news as it happens, follow me on Twitter. Give David a follow. David Balston, you're not on Twitter, are you?
The Chamber's on Twitter.
But you're not, are you?
I have been seen on Twitter.
One day, we're going to get you on one day. But all that's left for me is to thank both my guests, David Balston and David Osler, and we hope to catch you again.